Hi, welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited to welcome Mark Ramsey here with us. I'll introduce him in a moment. We're here to talk about effective strategies for leveraging clinical trials data as an asset. And with Mark's background as Chief Data and Analytics Officer, he's going to talk to us about his experience rationalizing clinical trials data and the steps to take to boost R&D outcomes by leveraging historical data as an asset. So thank you, Mark, for joining us.
No problem.
Mark,
glad to be here.
Great. Mark Ramsey has over 30 years of experience in the design and development and implementation and support of mission critical systems, leveraging data in analytics and optimizing to provide business advantage. He was the first Chief Data and Analytics Officer for GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, multinational pharmaceutical company headquartered in London, and is the world's 6th largest pharmaceutical company. So he has a lot of great experience to share with us today. And specifically, I think we'll talk about several data projects, but your experience rationalizing clinical trials specifically. And I'll be the moderator today. My name is Megan Laflamme. I am the Director of Product Marketing at Tamer. I'm really passionate about uncovering ways that companies can leverage their data as an asset. I've spent the past 8 years in healthcare IT. Really excited to be speaking to more folks in the biopharmaceutical companies. And most recently, I was at Kairos, which is the industry leader in provider search and scheduling solutions for health systems. All right, so we're going to kick things off. In this session, as I mentioned, Mark's going to share with us his experience as a Chief Data and Analytics Officer and rationalizing clinical trials to boost R&D outcomes, 7 steps for executing a successful program, and how the new approach to harmonizing clinical trials really leverages machine learning and a data ops approach to accelerate those time to insights. And we'll talk more about what that means in this session. So according to a recent study by Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, it costs up to $2.6 billion and can take up to 14 years to bring a new drug to market. And meanwhile, I'm sure everyone here is aware that revenues are going down for many pharma companies and competition is rising. So, there has to be a fundamental change in the design and development of new medicines. And one of the ways that many companies are looking to do that is to leverage their historical data as a strategic asset, starting with clinical trials and leveraging that existing data to uncover new insights, new therapies to streamline R&D efforts. And as I've had discussions with people across the industry, there continues to be challenges accessing that data in a meaningful way to inform business decisions, like what adverse events occurred in certain patient populations for a given medicine, which suppliers will help to minimize cost. Because of the cost of running a trial, companies are looking to get the most out of their existing data. And Mark, can you speak to how you've seen clinical trials data leveraged historically and where you're seeing a shift towards that data being used more as an asset?
Certainly. I mean, I think one of the things is a clinical trial produces a massive amount of data, but historically it's been used specifically to determine the characteristics of a particular medicine. And once those characteristics have been determined, then that new medicine is either filed and becomes a commercial product, or if it doesn't meet the expectations, then that program is discontinued. And so that's the traditional use of the clinical trial data. I think the next step is pharma companies recognize that there is interesting information in the completed trial that can be used for other purposes. But it's a little bit of a dilemma because that was not the intent of the data when it was created. And there typically can be a lot of concerns around what's called secondary use of that data. But within the pharma organization, there's really two key areas that can significantly benefit from reuse of that data. One is actually in the clinical operations or in the development part of the organization, understanding the characteristics of what has resulted in, let's call it a good trial or a good outcome, and contrasting that with some of the characteristics of maybe a trial that wasn't as successful. And so I would say that's usually the first area where a pharma company starts reusing some of the clinical trial data, is to actually improve future trials. But because of the granularity of the data that is captured in a clinical trial, there's usually a very high demand for reusing that data in the discovery characteristics, so in the research part of a pharma company. And I think that is normally the second area where pharma companies start understanding how they can reuse the data as a strategic asset. But it also sometimes there are barriers to really do that. So first is in improving future trials, and then the second is how to use that data to better understand in the discovery of new medicines.
Right. And, to do that, this study shows that a lot of companies are investing heavily in AI and machine learning. And I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for this. One, to reduce some of the manual overhead, to uncover those new therapies and insights, streamline operations, cut down costs. I'm curious, as maybe you could talk a bit about how you work with some pharma companies today, and if this aligns with what you're seeing in investments that they're making, and what are some of the drivers behind that?
Yeah, and I think the research here definitely reflects what I've seen happening in the pharma industry. Is there's a huge surge in the use of AI and machine learning in pharmaceuticals. And I again, it's in a couple of areas. One is in the discovery of new medicines and in the development of clinical trials, actually using technologies like machine learning to really discover patterns in whether it's protocol design or in site selection of a clinical trial or in the discovery of a new medicine. I think there's a lot of exciting progress happening in the use of machine learning to accelerate and automate the discovery of a new medicine. So tackling a number of the problems that typically historically have been fairly manual steps, doing those through automation and using machine learning and AI to really tackle those. In the study here, you'll see that one of the other areas that is seeing a lot of growth is in the genomics area. And actually, those two are not mutually exclusive. So there's a number of activities where folks are applying AI and machine learning to genomics data to really understand what are the variants or the characteristics that can improve or help select particular targets to look at. And so I think there's a lot of activity in that, which is probably about 95% of the media coverage and the stories and the articles are all skewed toward that part of using AI and machine learning. The thing that I think is underrepresented is actually using AI and machine learning on the data itself to really help rationalize and prepare the data so that you can deploy these types of technologies. People get so excited about AI and machine learning in the capabilities, but sometimes forget that in order to really leverage those technologies, it requires a very large amount of data to feed through those algorithms and really help you determine characteristics using that technology. The way I tend to characterize it is that AI and machine learning is sort of like icing on the cake, but you have to bake the cake first. And getting your data organized to be ready to feed into those algorithms is really the cake. And you can use AI and machine learning to help accelerate kind of baking your cake, if you will.
Yes. And, everyone is the saying, garbage in, garbage out. So, you alluded to some of the challenges around the data. Gartner estimates that the majority of analytics projects, for example, fail. And we see similar challenges across our customers that prevent progress on their AI or ML programs. Some of the, strategic initiatives like genomics and sequencing. And a lot of it comes down to these fundamental data challenges that are not new, but a lot of overhead on those manual data prep processes, consolidation and cleansing. It's difficult. Data is difficult to access, and so that leads to suboptimal business decisions, those inefficient workflows that prevent progress in some of those downstream strategic initiatives.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things is that a lot of people talk about the 80% of a data scientist or the use of analytics requires the munging of data or the cleanup of data, and it leaves only 20% for actual application of the analytics. It's kind of interesting because Michael Stonebreaker, the co-founder of Tamer, actually did some research and found that what he was seeing is it's closer to sometimes 95 or even 99% of the time spent by analysts is in really trying to sort out data challenges and do wrangling, and it leaves maybe even less than 1% of the time to actually do the real productive work of applying analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll talk about that actually as one of the steps in leveraging machine learning, taking a data ops approach so that teams are better enabled and have more time to focus on developing their advanced analytics skills. So we'll talk about a lot of the ways in which you've experienced and which ways data and analytics teams can mitigate those challenges and take that data ops approach to mastering clinical trials data. Before we dig in, maybe you could talk to us, Mark, a bit about either your current ventures or how you see data ops. What does data ops mean to you, and how has that informed some of your past experiences as a CDAO?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess to let folks know, I mean, I did, like you mentioned at the beginning, I was the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at GSK for about 4 years. And then early last year, I left and moved back into consulting, which it was what I was doing prior to joining GSK. And really, I've focused on the life sciences and healthcare industries because even though over my career I've worked with a large number of industries, GSK was actually the first pharmaceutical company that I had an opportunity to work with. And it was really fascinating to me, the differences in some of the challenges and the complexities of some of the data that really needs to be harnessed within pharmaceutical companies. And so I wanted to continue to have an opportunity to really tackle some of those challenges. And so since early last year, I've really been focused on working with a number of the top 25 pharma companies and really helping advise the work that they're thinking of doing, but then also getting actively engaged in helping them deploy large-scale data and analytics programs to tackle a lot of these challenges. So the points we're going to share here are things that have been successful across a number of pharma companies. And it will also talk about some of the challenges that I've had an opportunity to see that are similar across the industry. So these are not typically unique things, one company versus another. These are things that folks can take away, and typically from what I've seen thus far are very, very similar in all of the companies. And I guess on your question around data ops, I mean, for me, data ops is really coming up with a way to automate and accelerate the rationalization of data in order to be able to support the use of things like analytics or AI and machine learning. Because the traditional approaches that folks have used, and I, like you mentioned at the beginning, I kind of feel kind of old. I've been doing this for over 30 years. What's interesting is some companies are still trying to tackle the data challenges in exactly the same way that we started 25, 30 years ago, which is using basic ETL, mapping the data, trying to standardize the data using rules and policies. And we've proven time and time again over the last number of years that those really are not successful, which is why a large number of these programs fail. So to me, data ops is the way to turn these types of activities from a potential failure into a success by really building resilience into the process and recognizing that the way we tried to tackle these problems, 20 plus years ago, will not work today. And we have to do things in a different way. So that's what data ops means to me, is really building in the mechanisms to really make sure that we're as successful as possible.
Yeah, and you spoke about the automation piece. I think Andy Palmer, our co-founder CEO, I think he was one of the early folks who adopted or coined data ops. It's using the same principles of DevOps. Design for operations, repeatability, that automation and testing. It's critical to take that more agile approach instead of sort of boiling the whole ocean.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of times people do compare it to DevOps. I tend to caution people that there are some similarities, but there's also some pretty significant differences between a data ops implementation and really kind of the objectives around DevOps. I mean, there's similarities and differences, and and so, but I think we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that in a bit.
Absolutely. So first up, that you spoke about some of the challenges here. Maybe you can talk to the folks in the audience about how to get organizational approval around that secondary use of clinical trials data, how to address that for historical teams, and then also how to plan for that in the future. How do you see the market shifting to address this in the future?
Right. I mean, I think when folks talk about having executive level support for the rationalization of clinical trials, I think the most important area for that is in this first bullet, which is around really gaining organizational approval for using clinical trial data for what's referred to as secondary use. And one of those dimensions is in informed consent. Every patient that participates in a clinical trial signs an informed consent, either with an actual signature or electronically. And it's critically important that those informed consents authorize the use for the pharma company to use the data for other purposes outside of the specific trial that is being executed. For most pharma companies over the years, the language and the template that is used for informed consent tends to change over time. And I think this is an area where, what I've seen with some pharma companies is that maybe as recent as 2018 or even 2017, they've added specific language to further authorize the use of secondary use. But with a clinical trial, it takes a long time to run the clinical trials, especially like a phase 3 trial. So the trial may run for 3 to 5 years. And so really to gain the power here, the organization needs to understand how far back in time can they, based on the informed consent, be able to use this data for other purposes. And that's going to vary in every organization. And it's also, there's usually a lot of opinions in this area. And this is where the executive support comes to bear, and making sure that there's a good discussion with the legal part of the organization, and really understand what is captured in the previous informed consent. Now, there's a lot of other reasons of how far back in time you'd like to go. because typically if you go further back than maybe 8 or 10 years, the capture of the data, the validity of the data may not be worth, going back to a trial that was done 40 years ago or something. And also obviously technology has changed, how the data is captured has changed. But the fundamental piece is really around, having good discussions in the organization about the importance of using the data as a strategic asset, and really it's a level of risk. And that's where the organizations have to have a very frank discussion, because the least risky is to not use the data for any other purpose. But at the same time, that is actually taking on more risk for the organization, because I've seen pharma companies that, because they've locked down their own clinical trial data so much, that the scientists in the discovery part of the organization are forced to go outside of the organization and license external clinical trial data to use for analysis. And that actually significantly increases the risk to the organization. So it is a risk balancing activity that really needs to come to bear. And then certainly privacy, with the advent of CCPA and GDPR and a lot of the privacy requirements in different countries and in different states. That's extremely important in how the data is treated and the anonymization. There's usually concern and discussion around reanalysis of a clinical trial data, so that is there a risk that something new would be discovered that wasn't discovered in the original trial? And so there's approaches and ways to make sure that the organization is protected and that the right level of education is taken by those folks who are going to be looking at the very, very granular data. And so these are trade-off discussions, and the normal response within most organizations is, if we don't give access to the data, that's the safest situation and we don't have to deal with any of these issues. That may not actually be the least risky solution because of what I shared earlier. And this really requires executive level support to drive this forward and really elevate it to be a strategic decision for the organization, not a decision that is happening trial by trial for every person, not a decision that's made exclusively within clinical operations. It really does have to be a strategic decision for the organization.
That makes sense. So next, we talked about it's important to determine the use cases, both clinical and non-clinical, for that data to inform the strategy, inform the work. How do you begin doing this discovery and making these decisions, and who's at the table to determine these use cases typically?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I mean, I think part of this is there's always a risk, especially in a scientific organization, that more is better. And so the initial response you get is, yeah, I'd love to have access to more data. I'd love to have clinical trial data. And then the next question is, okay, how exactly would you use that data? What questions would you ask? What decisions would you make? And what would you do in a different way? And I think that's really the fundamental drive, or has to be the fundamental driving factor, is developing a collection of use cases of specific questions that can be answered, and really changing the way that the R&D process operates. Because unfortunately, adding more to what's already there is not going to help that challenge that you stated at the beginning, which is the length of time and the cost of actually discovering and developing a new medicine. And so it's critically important to look for opportunities where new approaches can be used to make decisions more effectively or faster, or some combination of those, but not just continue to add more layers onto what's already happening. And again, this is something where the actual scientist and the actual business has to be engaged. They have to be the ones that develop the request of how would they do things differently, what's getting in the way of making a decision, and how to use this information to, like I said, make a more effective decision that can happen faster and really have a better outcome. And so the people that need to be at the table are really those folks that own those decisions. So it's extremely important to understand who owns specific decisions as you work through the R&D process, and that getting agreement that they will take those decisions in a different way using data as a strategic asset, as opposed to this just being yet again another data point that comes in.
Right. So, the next step, before I think even you get to the rationalization, you mentioned in a previous conversation we have, you need to start with getting access. Maybe you can talk about some of the challenges or the steps to take to obtain that read access, and then where you can go from there.
Right. And again, I think this is also that case where executive support is important, and also changing the way of the status quo. Within most pharma organizations, the team that executed the trial is the team that has the decision authority on who can access that data and for what purposes. And for a lot of pharma organizations, what happens is that if there's a scientist that is interested in evaluating data from a past clinical trial, they have to document exactly the questions they're going to ask, what are they trying to do, and then they present that case to the folks who actually ran the clinical trial, and that group evaluates the request and then makes a decision as to whether they feel like the data in that trial could be used to answer that question. So it's very trial by trial by trial. And I guess if you have 5 trials, maybe that's a good way to run this. But when you have hundreds or thousands of trials, and really the value is in the core and the integrated view of all of those trials, that is just not an effective way. So again, this gets back to getting approval to actually get read access to every clinical trial. And that is typically within most pharma organizations, that is a very different way compared to the current approach that they use for the security of the trials. So going from trial by trial access to portfolio access is a big shift, and typically requires executive support and approvals and changes of standard operating procedure. But this can also be a huge failure point for an organization that's wanting to build a integrated, rationalized view of their clinical trial data. If it takes them months or years to get approval to each and every trial, that it's the starting point of a failure. So this getting read access and getting through this approval is a significant step in the process of creating rationalized clinical trial data.
Yeah. So once you've sort of determined those data sources, at Tamer, this is, you can see in this slide, a representation of some of the data challenges that we're really focused on. Our mission is to make those data sets analytics ready. And we work with customers to identify those data silos, whether it's homegrown databases or clinical ops repositories, map schemas across them, categorize that data so that it is curated and reconciled, ready for those analytics. But machine learning plays a critical role in that and does a lot of the heavy lifting around this with workflows that engage data experts. And you alluded to this earlier, the sort of more traditional approach, leveraging rules-based systems, whether it's ETL or MDM. I think it's well understood now that process is just continuing to contribute to the manual overhead and slowing those projects. We've seen higher accuracy with machine learning. It's typically 90% over time versus 50 to 70% at best in some rules-based systems. Can you talk about when did you start to introduce machine learning into your data architecture and reference? Which areas did you focus on in the whole data pipeline to leverage machine learning, and what kind of outcomes did you see from applying that technology?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you articulated, I mean, basically the clinical trial area was the first application of Tamer that really I focused on, and it was for the specific reasons that you mentioned, right? Clinical trials are an excellent example of taking data that should be similar, and each trial is slightly different, has some additional variables, maybe has some variables that aren't completed. The way it's captured is slightly different. And within a traditional pharma company approach, that when they finish a trial, in a lot of cases, a third party is hired to convert that data from its format into a standard CDISC SDTM format. And it's, a lot of cases that's done in a manual way, and it takes maybe 5 to 6 weeks to do that manual translation into the standard. And in an automated way, what happens is that the machine learning engines really develop a better understanding when they look across the portfolio of clinical trials. And so, for example, in the diagram that you're showing here, the trials come in from the left, it goes through the machine learning, and it creates those harmonized domains. One of the most popular domains of clinical trials is the demographics domain. And after ingesting 4 or 5 trials, we were actually experiencing 100% match rate on the demographics data. So every demographics variable coming through was properly matched and moved into the proper location in the CDISC domain. And so the audit trails that we received out of the process, we could confirm all of that, but it really meant that we didn't have to actually manually inspect every single trial, because we could see that the match rate was, the confidence level was high, the match rate was high. Some domains that you don't see as often, it may be in the 60-70% range, but the domains that are quite prevalent, the match rates that we were seeing and the confidence rates we were seeing were well above 95%. Some were in 100%, some were 97, 96 or whatever. And basically that means you just have a fewer number of things to review manually before that trial is completed. So instead of taking 6 weeks to rationalize a trial, you can do it in a day or two with the proper QC and everything on those trials.
Let's talk a little bit more about data ops. Earlier, I want to dig a little more into your feelings around some of the differences between data ops and DevOps. And what are your thoughts on organizations that are considering building these capabilities themselves, leveraging machine learning libraries, for example?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of companies that try to do that, and I think it's potentially valid in some areas of applying machine learning to standard business problems, or you're trying to try a new algorithm to answer a particular question. If you look around data ops is more than the machine learning. It's a combination of the machine learning, crowdsourcing or expert surveys to answer particular questions, and the workflow to process all of this, because this is not a once and done. That's a topic that I have with a lot of folks. You don't rationalize a clinical trial one time and be done, because if you did, then you would say, okay, it takes me 6 weeks to do it manually, and it takes me a day to do it using automation. What are the cost differences? Or but this is something that happens time and time again, because the CDISC model evolves over time, and you want to keep your integrated data up to the latest version of CDISC. And so this is something that if you have 1,000 clinical trials, every time that there's a new version of CDISC, you have to run the 1,000 clinical trials through the rationalization to repartition things into the proper domains, which means having a high degree of automation is really the only way to keep things current. It's very different than the operational translation of the trial for submission, which is done once and then kind of locked down and never changed. When you're talking about using the portfolio of clinical trials to be a strategic asset, you need to do this on an ongoing basis, which is why automation is critically important. And schema drift on the inbound side and on the outbound side, you have to build in the process to deal with that, which I think is a fundamental capability within data ops. The reason that I try to avoid, directly comparing it to DevOps is there's this concept of a minimally viable product and agile development, and you build just a really thin UI doing a few things, and then you just quickly add features. That approach doesn't work at all in data, because having 20% of the data means you're still not able to do the work that you need to do. And so that's why the concept of a minimally viable product really doesn't translate well to data ops. Now, a lot of the other things do, but you really need to develop a full-scale capability to handle the data flowing through the ecosystem, and you want to do that quickly and in an automated way. But there are differences between DevOps and data ops.
Well, let's talk about some of the downstream applications, which you alluded to in the last points. We talked about the consumption endpoints, thinking about the application of these. From determining the consumption endpoints, also to understand the linkage of clinical trials data to other sources like genomics. Maybe you can expand on, beyond the curated clinical trials data sets, how you think about the whole sort of data pipeline and breaking down these processes to further enrich that clinical trials data and make it ready for the business R&D teams, clinical ops teams who now need to leverage it.
Right. I mean, I think one of the characteristics of many pharma organizations, especially in R&D, is a lot of fragmentation, because the steps in the process are broken into teams, and those teams operate fairly independently. And unfortunately, what happens is then the data and the silos that are created for each of those capabilities within the organization, it builds a barrier in order to really harness the power across the organization. And a good example is, we've been talking a lot today about clinical trial data, which is normally within the development part of the organization, and it's executed by clinical operations, and the statistics are run by the clin stats team, and all of that is happening within the clinical part of the organization. But that data can be very valuable to the discovery or the R&D part of the organization. It's just how does that get shared, and that's where rationalizing the data and making that available is something that really encourages using that data in the preclinical part of the organization. Now, in addition to that, another aspect is in real world data, where that data is used to influence the design of a clinical trial, but it can also be used in phase 3B or 4 studies on marketing characteristics and commercial aspects of an existing medication. But again, it can be used to help understand things in the preclinical space. But in most organizations, there's clinical, and then there's another part of the organization that's focused on real world data, and yet again another part of the organization that's focused on genomics, and all of those are built as independent systems, and the way that the data is captured is very unique to those areas. Well, if you kind of take a step back, ideally what you want to be able to do is bring these things together, and that's where being able to automate the rationalization of the data really can accelerate some of those things. So one example might be, we've talked about clinical trial data and putting that data into the CDISC STDM industry standard for clinical trial data. You could also take clinical trial data and put it into what's called OMOP, which is the standard for real world data. And if you have your own clinical trial data in OMOP format, then you can combine it with the third-party electronic health record data that comes in, that is in or can be rationalized to OMOP format from real-world data. And in addition to that, like's on the chart here, one of the popular genomics data sources is the UK Biobank, which is 10 years of medical history combined with genotype data. Well, that 10 years of medical history is basically electronic health record data. So if you standardize that data into OMOP, all of a sudden you can begin to do comparisons and cohort analysis between genetics and genomics data from UK Biobank, the very detailed and structured data of the clinical trial data, and then the data that you're acquiring from electronic health record suppliers like Optum, Atruvin, and Symphony, and others. And so that really begins to allow you to traverse. Now, you're not able to connect it because it's all anonymized data and things like that, but you can do comparative analysis of what characteristics and phenotypes am I seeing within the clinical trial data? How does that compare to a much larger patient population in the real world data? And how does that link to genetic variants in the UK Biobank data? So it's a connect the dots exercise.
Right. To derive the most value from this data, how do you go about roadshows and driving adoption for other teams? You know, you mentioned like market analysis and other areas of the org outside of R&D. How did you go about ensuring that the office of the CDAO was driving additional downstream applications outside of, you know, some of the first couple of business use cases identified?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is always a trade-off. It's a challenge, right? Because what you don't want to do is go very, very wide, but very, very shallow, right? So what I encourage pharma organizations to do is really pick what will be the most impactful within the organization, understand those use cases, understand how a portfolio of data can really help influence those strategic decisions, and really promote sharing the data across the organization. But I would also caution that if you try to solve too many problems across too many parts of the organization, it really dilutes the value. And so that's a trade-off, because the natural tendency is, gosh, we've got this data, let's go shop it around and do a roadshow. But is that really changing that big challenge that you put up in front, the $2.6 billion in 14 years? If it is, then great, but what you really want to end up with is a collection of use cases that you can then prioritize based on executability and the value to the organization. And I don't mean cost cutting or productivity. I mean, what's really going to change and make a huge impact in the organization. And those use cases need to be prioritized and be the focus. Otherwise, you can just get involved with way too many different components and not really have a huge impact that can really happen when this is done correctly.
Yeah, great point. I think this is our final step on as teams are saving time by, you know, leveraging machine learning to do some of the heavy lifting and taking that data ops approach. Can you talk about the need and the approach to developing advanced analytic skills within the team and some of the strategies and tactics that you use to develop this expertise within your teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, what I've learned over the last number of years is that within a scientific community, there's a lot of passion for learning and trying new things, and analytic skills are not different, right? So the risk is that you end up with everyone thinking that they can download an R package and build an analytic model and teach themselves how to do AI and machine learning. So you end up with a large number of well-meaning amateurs that really don't have the focus and the ability to execute and build something that is at a production level and that's really going to impact those use cases. And so, I really encourage pharma organizations to build a dedicated team of highly skilled analytics, AI, machine learning, and other types of analytics, and really have that be the center of excellence for the analytic skills in the organization. Now, it's certainly important to spread the knowledge and get other folks engaged, but you really want to focus on having top talent within the organization that can be the catalyst for how to actually develop models and deploy those models into production, and do that on a limited number of highly impactful areas. Don't try to, again, say we're going to use AI and machine learning on every problem that we have. It really needs to focus in on what are the ones that are going to make a difference. And
Yeah.
if that's 3 or 5 or 10 or whatever the number is, but have a dedicated team that leads the charge on that. But it has to be done in very tight collaboration with the scientists and the business that will be using the outcome of those models to change the way that they're making the decisions. In most organizations, they really lack the talent, the AI machine learning talent, to try to do this themselves. And there's a lot of folks, like I said, that can read a book and learn how to download an R package or Python and run a model and look at the results and things. But where I've seen this done successfully are cases where a dedicated team is built and it really has the focus on driving the consumption of the rationalized data into AI and machine learning models that then result in complete changes in the way that certain key decisions in the organizations are made.
That makes sense. So then you're leveraging all of the learnings from these advanced analytics programs to power a lot of data projects, and as opposed to if you have work split across stats and BI teams across different groups, there's less repeatability, there's less sharing of that knowledge, I imagine.
Yeah, and I've seen some organizations get caught up in discussions around what is machine learning. Well, gosh, it's a technology that was developed 25 years ago, and it's what the statistics team has used to, execute a clinical trial. I mean, here what we're talking about is what actions can we take that are transformational to the organization, make a difference on that 2.6 billion in 14 years, and really tackle key problems. And it requires a dedicated focus. It isn't someone's part-time job to figure out how to use algorithms and solve these types of problems. Now, that doesn't mean that the broader organization can't benefit from using newer analytics and trying different approaches. But what you don't want is the Wild West, where everyone is downloading different things and trying out. You really need a repeatable process and a well-defined process using a select number of tools, and it uses the data that has been rationalized using the process that we talked about earlier. So again, it's all around key focus and making sure that the use cases are going to make a huge difference in the organization.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the impact. What are some of the key business outcomes that teams can focus on as they embark on a clinical trials rationalization project? And from your experience, what are some of the impact and results that you saw from that robust data repository?
Yeah, and I think again, I think it happens in the development area. So I think there's the opportunity to have a significant positive impact on the design and implementation of future clinical trials by really being able to analyze the entire portfolio of past trials. So it can be things like better understanding high performing and underperforming sites for site selection, protocol design, actual understanding of the outcomes of trials to try to improve the process that is designed for future trials. So a lot of operational types of impact in the development part of the business, and also on the preclinical area. It opens up a vast amount of data points that can be used to understand what successes and failures have occurred in the clinical trial area to prevent reproducing something that will result in a failure in a late stage trial. So it really helps put guardrails on discovery activities by understanding the actual impacts that have happened within past clinical trials, because you do have a robust collection of lab results and indications and a lot of different characteristics of those completed trials that can be really a key factor in target selection and target validation and the progression of a potential new medicine in the preclinical area. So it's in both of those areas, there's a massive amount of benefit.
Awesome. All right. I think that brings us to the, so just to summarize, from executive approval is key. We talked about the sort of center of excellence to drive a lot of these data ops strategies, but it's critical to work with the business, work with the scientists to just determine those consumption endpoints and create focus and prioritization around the business problems that will drive the most value. And anything that you wanted to add on top of this, and we could just jump into some questions and answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing here is that many companies try to just tackle a handful of trials and then try to tackle the next handful of trials. And I've seen that fail a number of times within pharma organizations because it just, the length of time to try to solve that problem. So they really need to view their clinical trial data as a portfolio and as an asset for the organization. And that's why really the 7 steps here are set up to really go after, you know, whatever you define as the valid area of trials. And, you know, it should be hundreds or thousands of trials, not single digits or tens. And then build a data ops flow that really can tackle those and continue to keep those current. So it's really tackle the problem. Don't try to just kind of nip around the edges, so to speak.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Mark. We have a few minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions from the group.
Okay.
We'll see how many we get through in the next few minutes. One of these you actually answered. Do you recommend the Center of Excellence across R&D? Does it make more sense to let each focus group work with their respective teams? I think you had a great response to that. What are the key domains within research or development that you found derived value from the clinical trial data repository?
Yeah, and I think we touched a little bit on this, but I mean, it's really, it's that linkage of data across the number of areas. So certainly clinical trial data combined with genomics data, clinical trial data combined with real world data, and even looking at the clinical trial data itself to understand potential opportunities to reduce the white space between the different phases of a clinical trial. So there's a number of areas that can really drive significant value out of the portfolio of clinical trial data.
Yeah.
And I guess one thing just to follow on, the one thing we haven't talked a lot about is linking internal clinical trial data with external data, like the portfolio of data in clinicaltrials.gov really opens up a tremendous opportunity to do comparative analysis between how a particular pharma company designs their trials, the execution, and how they compare to their peer group or within certain disease areas, or, you know, there's a lot of that comparative analysis that can be done between the internal data and the external data.
Exactly. It's connecting those internal and external sources are critical. A lot of our customers are, tend to start with their internal sources, but are finding hugely enriched insights and value from being able to then layer in that external third-party data as well.
Sure.
What lessons learned would you warn teams about embarking on a legacy trial harmonization project for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of lessons learned. One is that the organizational resistance may be higher. A lot of times people think of this as a technical challenge of the actual technology of rationalizing the trials, which is is critically important. But I think the organizational resistance and the number of roadblocks that are there, like I said, that's why it's critically important to have senior executive support, because there's a lot of, you're definitely swimming upstream to a lot of policies, procedures, constraints, restrictions, access, and those things tend to be a lot more pervasive than what I think most folks realize.
Sure. I think we've got time for one more question. Were there key architecture decisions that needed to be put in place before beginning this project, and then also then before maximizing the value for the R&D teams. So I think the architecture decisions, I imagine, in reference to like a reference architecture as you were thinking about your data pipeline.
Yeah, I think architectural design is critically important at the beginning because it helps you understand the scalability of what you're building. I mean, you have to keep in mind that a single clinical trial can have billions of data points. And so we're not talking about 5 sheets of paper of data. We're talking about millions, if not billions of data points. And so when you begin to stack those together, it can require a significant amount of compute resource, and it can also require a decent amount of storage in order to handle those. So it's very important to build scalability into the architecture. And I would say the number one area of focus is really around the security model of how to protect the data, how to then later at the consumption endpoints grant different levels of access to the clinical trial data based on the specific needs and the use cases and what is required. So, because of the privacy and security and disclosure and informed consent that we talked about, security is critically important, encryption of the data, but also being able to grant access to components of the data and layers of the data. So that security model is critically important from the beginning. So you have to kind of build that in, recognizing that you're going to have to anonymize data to deliver it to some parts of the organization. You have to obfuscate some of the data to deliver it in some cases. You have to remove some data elements in some cases, but some use cases require the very detailed non-anonymized data. So you're going to have layers of access privileges and things to deal with, and that really needs to be built into the security model.
When you're thinking about scalability and compute and storage costs, and you're balancing with governance and privacy and others, do you find that pharma companies are embracing the shift towards the cloud, or is there still hesitance because of some of those former challenges?
No, I mean, people talk about, there's a risk of putting data in the cloud because of security, but I mean, that was an original pushback maybe, 5 years or so ago. I think people recognize now that the data in the cloud is probably as secure, if not more secure than the data that's on-prem. But again, that's one of those discussions. This type of solution, I've been involved with implementing it in a completely on-prem solution, and I've been involved in implementing it in a completely cloud delivery solution and in combinations. My advice is always to architect the solution to be hybrid multi-cloud, and then that really allows you to pick and choose down the road if there's a particular cloud provider that is giving unique capabilities or a different price point, as well as there may be some aspects of the data that needs to be on-prem. So as long as you architect the solution to be hybrid multi-cloud, you're really protecting the investment and you're not getting locked into one dimension or another.
Absolutely. Mark, we're at time. I want to thank you so much for joining us. This was a really great discussion. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers found this to be very valuable. So thank you for your time.
You're welcome. It was fun to be here.
Awesome. Great. And for our audience, you can reach out to Tamer at leverage.data@tamer.com. Please follow us on Twitter. We've got some great content coming out related to these topics. So we look forward to hearing from you, and Mark will certainly talk to you in the future.
Sounds good. Have a good one.
Thanks.